Welcome to the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. My name is Keiran.pedley. Well, on this week's show, we're going to be looking back at last week's by-elections and what they can tell us about the political future of Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer as we head towards the next general election. We'll be talking about the impact of ULEZ in Uxbridge in particular and what that means for green policies moving forward. And we'll be taking a deep dive look into the personal poll ratings of Rishi Sunak and the man that wants to replace him as Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. To do all that, I'm joined by my colleagues Cameron.garrett and Holly.day. Welcome to you both. And Holly's sort of remotely with us today, so we're sort of staring down a screen at her today. Holly, how are things up north?
Yeah, I'm sad I'm not down there with you guys. It looks quite cosy in the studio today.
Yeah, it's better than being out in the rain. So, Cameron, have you been watching Barbie or Oppenheimer?
Yeah, I saw Barbie over the weekend. I haven't seen Oppenheimer
yet. Was it good?
Yeah, I think lots to go away and talk about.
Maybe not on this week's podcast. If you can get a Barbie pun in the show, I will make you a tea. So, high stakes.
Okay, I'll try my best. Wish I had pre-warning for this.
Well, you've got to put you on the spot. Let's talk about this last week then. I'll come to you both for sort of immediate reactions. But what did you take away, Cameron, from the by-elections?
So I think on the face of it, there's something for everyone, right? Each party of the main parties won a seat, one of the by-elections. But I think actually that would be a misreading for the Conservative Party. And I think you have to look beneath it a bit. And actually what we have seen is the pincer movement. That should be worrying the Conservatives, where you have Labour overturning massive Conservative majorities up in kind of what was the Brexit heartland, which they overturned in 2019. And then you have down in the blue wall, the Lib Dems overturning big Conservative majorities. And I think that should be very worrying for them going to a general election. There you are seeing Labour reflecting what the polls are saying, if not exceeding them a bit. Obviously, there's Uxbridge, which was kind of, I'm sure we'll get into this, but I think that was a bit more of an anomaly, probably more focused on local issues. And I think if we're looking towards elections next year, we should be looking at Selby and Somerton to say what's going to be happening in the general election, maybe more of the national picture, and maybe Uxbridge will be more informative for the mayoral elections next May.
Holly, what are your thoughts?
It was the mood music afterwards that I think was what struck me. I unfortunately fell asleep in the middle of by-election evening, which is like
Holly.
bit of a sin as a pollster. I know I managed to stay up till about 2 a.m. when I thought I knew pretty much by then what would happen. The announcement of a recount is what I think sent me off to sleep, unfortunately. But when I woke up with the results that you've just mentioned, Cameron, I think the fact that there were kind of two of the biggest swings in history in Selby and in Somerton and Frome for two different parties across by-elections, the fact that they were almost overshadowed by what had happened in Uxbridge is, I think, that what surprised me the most, with the main story coming out of the evening from what I've read and from what I've seen, being that Labour didn't manage to obviously take control of Uxbridge and the repercussions of that and all the discussions on ULEZ and green policy that have come off the back of that. I think the fact that they overshadowed the monumental swings that we saw was the most interesting thing for me.
Yeah, I think when you look at these by-elections, what stands out for me is Selby and Aintree. I think that you're right to call it a pincer movement, Cameron, with the Liberal Democrats on one side and Labour on the other. But you're looking at a 24-point swing from the Conservatives to Labour in Selby and Aintree. Now, before last Thursday, Labour's last by-election gain was last year in Wakefield, but you have to go back to 2012 before then. So even a gain of any kind, you could be spun as positive for Labour. But one that's a 24-point swing is reminiscent of Tony Blair's Labour Party in the mid-90s. And whilst you can't predict that the same thing will happen again, very different contexts, very different political scenario, the fact that Labour are actually getting those kinds of swings, a year or so out from a general election, is pretty ominous for the Conservatives. On Uxbridge, I mean, yes, it will worry Labour slightly that they didn't take that, because whilst I think ULEZ itself is a very local issue that can't save the Conservatives nationally, it does show that where the Conservatives can find that magic issue to take Labour on with, then maybe they can, where they can make things a referendum on Conservative versus Labour for the future, perhaps, they might have an in rather than a referendum on their record in government the past 13 years, which is pretty negative. But what's not clear is what that issue would be.
Yeah. And
nationally.
also they won Oxbridge, but to dig deep into how they won it, like 495 votes, still a 7-point swing towards the Labour Party. Like a 7-point swing wouldn't be enough for a Labour majority, but we'd be talking Labour biggest party if that was replicated nationally. So I can see why they're holding on to it and using that, trying to push that forward with the narrative, but I don't think it's particularly promising for them.
And of course, with Sadiq Khan facing a re-election, I think it's next year, that system being first past the post now, I'm not sure how vulnerable I necessarily would think he is at this stage, but it at least creates an interest in what the outcome of that will be. Whereas I think under the ranked choice system, it was very, very difficult to see how he would have lost that. Whereas you can imagine a world where under first past the post, perhaps a Conservative squeaks in. But yeah, let's see. That will depend a lot on the actual wider political environment this time next year. But don't forget, Sadiq Khan won the first round last time by 5 points. Different political environment in 2021 to now, so we shouldn't assume that's the baseline or anything like that. But it can be done. So we have to sort of watch this space. But I suppose, Holly, talking about Uxbridge and ULEZ and things like that, it has raised a question with Labour about their green policies, hasn't it? There seems to be an intense debate at Labour's policy forum over the weekend, which won't have registered with the public, but may have implications for the manifesto. What's your take on some of these discussions about sort of green issues, if we can use that term?
I think I was genuinely quite surprised, actually, when Starmer did come out the next day. I think he said it to Laura Kuenssberg in an interview, and he literally said, I don't think there's any doubt that ULEZ was the reason that we lost that by-election. And I almost expected... I don't know how Sadiq Khan would have felt about that when he heard that on the TV or the radio, but I wasn't expecting him to kind of not throw him under the bus, but make such a big deal of it that it then became the key thing that everyone's talking about. As I said, that the swings in Selby and Ainsty in a traditional kind of Tory heartland was unbelievable, and the fact that they weren't really focusing on that as much was surprising. And now it's brought us round to the debate about it's kind of net zero almost versus the cost of living crisis and the trade-offs that people may or may not be willing to make for some of these policies. And I know that the Conservative lines of recent times have been about the kind of amount of money that the Labour Party might be planning on spending on some of these green policies. And we saw, I think it was last month or a matter of months ago, they were pushing back the timetable or elongating the timetable on one of their main green energy plans. So it's certainly making the Labour Party think about how much money they're willing to spend on these policies, and particularly how they're going to frame them to the electorate. If the electorate are seeing them as policies that are going to cost them money personally, even if it's for the kind of overarching good of preventing climate change or slowing down climate change or helping the environment, ultimately, if it's seen to be hitting people's pockets in the short term, that's kind of that's the problem that the Labour Party have to overcome at the moment, and particularly with the cost of living crisis in the economy sitting at the top of our issues index again this month, and has been consistently for a number of months now. They're really going to face a challenge when the environment on our issues index is sitting down at number 8. So there's a big discrepancy at the minute in terms of the electorate and the public's priorities and the issues that they feel like are hurting them the most when it comes to that trade-off.
I do think that when it comes to environmental issues and policies around climate change, it is one of those where the devil really is in the detail. At a baseline level, our polling last summer showed, I think it was around 84% off the top of my head, concerned about the impact of climate change. The public were more inclined to want net zero targets to be brought forward rather than delayed. But of course, that's in many ways in the abstract, to build on what Holly's just been saying. When you get into the detail of specific policies, there's a lot of public support for things that essentially involve less sacrifice for them. So things like government subsidies for clean energy, let's say, or encouraging businesses to invest in a sort of climate friendly way and that sort of thing. But when it comes to sort of almost punitive, if that's the right phrase, policies like taxing meat and dairy, let's say, or air travel, that's where it gets a lot more contentious and a lot more difficult. And I suppose that's going to be interesting to see how both main parties go into the next election, as Holly says, with the cost of living so important, because presumably you can't get to net zero without some pain, but you don't want to present further pain, shall we say, going into an election.
Yep, and I think Labour need to be really careful how they frame this. Like Holly was saying, they've put Sadiq Khan out there and kind of hung him out to dry, as it were, kind of forgetting he also has to fight an election next year to be re-elected for them.
Well, yeah, because if anything's going to change the mood music, I mean, not that London means everything, but if Labour were to lose City Hall next year, that could be quite a significant moment in the perception of that general election.
Yeah, and
rightly or wrongly.
Some of what we've been seeing this week about Labour having this internal debate and kind of becoming a bit more divided almost. They don't want to be divided on election on an issue going into an election. Divided parties always suffer, and then also they need to be careful about their electorate and who they're keeping close to them. Lots of Labour voters, the environment will be really important to them, and the Green Party is standing there at their wings if Labour start alienating these voters.
Yeah, it's interesting on the Greens. It sounds like a pathetic name drop. I was on Times Radio earlier today talking about exactly this topic that you mentioned.
Didn't know you're better than this podcast, Kieran.
I wouldn't say that at all. But one of the questions people do ask, it comes up a fair bit, is like, why aren't the Greens doing better in the national polls, right? And so on average at the moment, they're about 6 points. And this is not unusual at this stage of a parliament. In 2019, in June, they were at 8. They ended up getting, I think it was 2 or 3, just under 3, I think, % nationally at the 2019 general election. So they tend to get squeezed as an election approaches, and I think a lot of that is to do with our electoral system, let's be honest. I don't think it's that controversial to say if we had proportional representation, the Greens would probably do a lot better. But right now, the actual penalty, the Green penalty, if you like, that Labour have is pretty minimal. If you look at the Green vote, around 1 in 4 Green voters right now say they voted Labour at the last general election. Sounds a lot. It's a decent proportion of the Green vote, but the Green vote is 6%. So it's actually worth to Labour 1 or 2 points nationally, which it would mean a lot in a very close race potentially. But if you think it's going to be squeezed anyway, it's probably not going to mean that much. Now, obviously, Labour can't take any votes for granted. My suspicion is that as it comes to this general election, they'll probably do a quite effective job of squeezing any lab to Green vote that they might want to. I think where I could see them definitely doing well, and you might want to buy shares in the Green Party, is under a Starmer government, where maybe he's producing policies that disappoint sort of the progressive left, and maybe the Greens become a bit of a home. Whether that's a protest vote, whether that actually manifests itself in seats down the line. I could see it certainly at local level. That's for the future maybe, but I think for now the Greens are probably going to struggle just because of the inbuilt challenges that they've got in our electoral system, and also without casting any shade, they don't have the sort of high profile leaders that on the right. When Nigel Farage has led the Brexit Party or UKIP, he's very much a household name in a way that Green leaders aren't. Speaking of leadership, though, Cameron, on our most recent political polls, we had some questions around Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, and I suppose our elections feel like they've become more presidentialised, to use a phrase, over time. So what the public think of Sunak and Starmer is going to matter a lot to the outcome of the next election. So what do our political polls findings show?
Yep, so I think we have this strong Labour lead in polling at the minute on voting intention. They're double digits ahead, depending on what polls you look at, up to 20, down to 10. But I think it's interesting when you look underneath their numbers, you've got to question whether that lead is Tory weakness or Starmer strength, because the public are still actually quite divided on Keir Starmer. He's not, they're not run away with him in positivity, 39% unfavourable compared to 32% favourable, so he's on -7. In our political monitor at the minute, looking at satisfactions, he's kind of in line with Ed Miliband, so not overwhelmingly positive, but of course it's always about who you're facing, and he just needs to be better than the other person. And fortunately for him, he is better than Rishi Sunak at the minute, where 47% are unfavourable and 21% favourable, net of -21. So he is ahead of Sunak, and people are more positive about the prospect of a Keir Starmer government than how Sunak's currently performing. They think he'll do better, but they're kind of still unconvinced Labour is ready, and whether Keir Starmer's ready to be Prime Minister. So there's kind of I'd say it's kind of a soft Labour lead. It's kind of more we're against the Tories, but Labour still have work to do.
I suppose the big question when you sort of look at the analysis is how baked in you think that sort of antipathy towards the Conservatives is. And I suppose we can't really know that. I mean, if the economic mood music changes in the next year or so, maybe the polls will change with it. But I think there's a famous sort of quote, which I'm going to butcher, from Prime Minister Jim Callaghan in the late 70s around the fact that, you know, every now and then there is just a sea change in views, and at the moment our polling shows 2/3 of the public think it's time for a change, and maybe that's just baked in and there's not really a lot the Conservatives can do. But it does, if you're being an optimistic Conservative, it does show the route back. If the economy does look better in 2024 and they make some progress on some of these pledges, then there isn't a lot of enthusiasm for Labour. As you say, it's a binary choice. So Ed Miliband wasn't particularly popular. He wasn't hugely unpopular. I think that's overestimated, but he wasn't popular, and he was up against a Prime Minister in David Cameron that was seen as more competent.
Yeah, it's all relative.
And it's all relative. At the moment, Starmer's kind of ahead on a lot of these measures, but that could potentially change as there's more scrutiny on Labour going into an election. And if, this is the crucial thing really, if there is better economic news and people feel it themselves as well, you're not just being told that inflation's halved or whatever, but you actually feel better off, and it's a big ask at the moment. I mean, Holly, what do you take of this kind of debate about sort of Tory weakness and Labour strength?
Yeah, I think a lot of our polling at the minute is still continuing to show that the public are on the fence about Starmer, and that they've not really made up their minds on a lot of his attributes. So we did some polling recently on a Political Pulse about the different factors and what sort of whether people have a positive or negative impression about Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak on these particular factors, that things like whether they're a good leader, whether they've got good communication style, whether they'd be trusted to deal with the cost of living crisis, for example. And Starmer does actually have a very marginal positive score on some of these things, particularly to do with his communication skills, his policies on public services, which I think is going to be a really, really key one, particularly with the way those public services are moving up our issues index in recent months, and also on how well he leads his party. But there still is a negative impression on how competent he is to do the job of Prime Minister, and that's still a sticking point for the electorate and the public at large, I think, which he's really going to have to try and overcome in the coming months, to give the public a view that he does have the skills and he does have the competencies to lead the country. Where it's looking good for him currently is on all of those measures, particularly the ones that are the most important factors to the public. He's absolutely miles ahead of Rishi Sunak, right? So we're talking 20-30 points ahead on who's got the best policies to deal with the cost of living crisis, whether or not they understand the problems facing British people, which I think is quite an important one. And on the public services measure that I mentioned earlier, I think he's about 35 points ahead or something like really quite stark between him and Sunak. So Sunak's got some work to do on those personal factors, but particularly on the ones about whether he's fit to govern. That's where Starmer's got to make his move.
Yeah, I think a general election on cost of living and the NHS can be very, very difficult for the Conservatives. And I think one of the biggest problems they've got is that as much as they'd like to move the conversation onto immigration, let's say, and asylum, which is traditionally an area which Conservative voters care about an awful lot, which our issues index does show, it's right up there, might even be joint top for Conservative voters from 2019. The fact is they don't think that Rishi Sunak's Conservatives are doing a good job on it. So it's a difficult dividing line to have with Labour when your voters don't think you're doing very well at it, although they may well turn out to think that you do better than Labour.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on one other thing that Cameron said earlier about division, and that a party has to be seen as being kind of united in order to govern effectively. And I think that's one thing that potentially the Conservatives are going to be picking up on off the back of these by-elections, with the narrative between the leadership and the Mayor of London. Also, we've seen at the National Policy Forum that's happened in the past couple of weeks, there have been some murmurings on disquiet between the membership, the trade unions, and the leadership on Labour policy. And it's when we start to get close enough to an election, dare I say it, that we start talking about specific policies that people can pick into, that the Conservatives might have something to get their teeth into if they can see different kind of strands of the Labour Party themselves infighting on particular policies that the government may themselves have a strategy on that's more coherent.
I do think there's a challenge as well for Keir Starmer, which is about, shall we say, a tendency to change his mind, shall we say, on certain policies or go back on original pledges, and like how much leeway you give him on that may well depend on your own personal political persuasion. But it's not hard to imagine a Tory attack ad at the next election, Cameron, that has, well, Keir Starmer once said this and now he says that, and then on a host of issues, whether that's his fairly Corbyn-friendly pledges to win the Labour leadership, which he's rode back on pretty much all of them. I haven't got the 10 or so committed to memory, but there's quite a few examples. I think with ULEZ, I think I'm pretty confident, like last December, there was a quote of him saying, no, ULEZ is great, or not, if not great, it's like we need to do it because it's all about clean air for our kids and that sort of thing. And then he's saying, well, actually, it's a terrible policy, da-da-da-da-da-da. I'd be cautious about that because whilst right now it doesn't seem to be landing in the intensity of a general election, where there's obviously this, as Holly mentions, there's this real intense scrutiny on policy. If you can position Starmer as someone, well, you know, you can't really quite believe what he's saying, that could be damaging, because I think in some ways one of Starmer's strengths as a candidate is that he kind of does look and sound like a sort of prime minister out of central casting, and all the sort of issues that creates around unconscious bias about the white male lawyer, and being a sort of looks and sounds like a prime minister. I think there is some truth to that, which is why inherently the public sort of buy it as an idea. But then he also could be spun as just another politician, if people come to view him as a bit shady and slippery and don't trust him on policies. So I do think that is something that it might be a slow burn. It might be something that's not an obvious problem.
And you can
at the
see
moment.
Labour trying to push this line of, no, he's taken the tough decisions. Actually, this is why it's the.
And you've always got, I think, on trust specifically between Starmer and Sunak and Labour and the Conservatives. If trust is going to be an issue for either party at the moment, it looks like it's for the Conservatives and for Sunak. But yeah, we all know how things change in a general election. I guess let's do sort of final wrap up words from each of you. I'll come to you, Cameron, first, and then Holly. Just maybe what's the main things you've noticed the last week, and what are you going to be keeping an eye on when our next political monitor comes out and into the summer?
I think it's that introspection that the Labour Party are currently having on ULEZ is going to be really interesting, and how that policy develops. And like Holly was saying, policy is going to be really getting more and more important. And you picked up on about how Keir Starmer's kind of dropped his original Jeremy Corbyn pledges. And Jeremy Corbyn, I'm not sure if you've seen, has actually been floating about maybe running as London mayor, kind of trying to pull off a Livingston. I wonder whether he'd be better because he's Jeremy and Livingston was just Ken. For my Barbie pun at the end there.
Oh, fantastic.
Oh, man. You let him squeeze that in right at the end, Kieran.
I owe him a cup of tea. I have to.
I've been thinking about how I can mention Ken Livingstone for a while now.
That is, that is very, very good. I can't really follow that. Holly, do your best.
No, I was gonna try and drop an Oppenheimer one in, but I think that would be a bit too bleak, to be honest.
Yes, our Tory is going to go nuclear at the next election. Yes, very good.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've not managed to see it yet either, because all the IMAX seats are booked up.
It's very long.
Maybe on the next podcast. 3 hours. Who can sit through that?
As long as the run up to this election.
Yeah, if I fall asleep during a by-election, I'm going to fall asleep during a 3-hour film, aren't I? But I think my key takeaways are basically, when the dust settles, how are Labour going to reflect on their performance on the by-elections last week? Because as I've said a couple of times, to achieve the swing that they did in Selby, and also what the pincer movement that I think Cameron mentioned earlier, the way that the Lib Dems and Labour looked to have worked that quite well in Somerton and in Selby. That would be interesting to keep an eye on whether that can translate into an election, as we mentioned before, and also whether another Lib Dem can get elected to Parliament called Sarah, because fun fact of the day, currently a fifth of the Lib Dem MPs are called Sarah, which I thought was quite interesting. Although the Sarah that just won in Somerton, that boundary change means that that seat isn't actually going to exist in the general election. So after all that, She's going to have to fight it on a different boundary.
Which will see a 20%
awkward.
drop in Sarah's amongst the Liberal Democrat, parliamentary contingent. Well, yeah, certainly plenty for us all to keep an eye out as our next Political Monitor and Political Pulse comes out. That's all we've got time for this week's Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. Big thanks to Cameron.Garrett and Holly.day for joining me. If you like what you see/hear, please do like and subscribe and tell a friend about us. It does help spread the word. But for now, thanks for listening and watching, and see you next time.